What does it really mean that you've gotten direwolves back to life?
Yeah. So, all of the projects that we're working on, we kind of walked through the science at a high level, but we want to focus on different species that have different aspects and different impact, right? So we want to think about conservation. What are the technical challenges? What's possible? What's even possible? And before we worked on the direwolf project, no one had ever gotten more than about 0.15x of the genome, meaning about 15% coverage. They'd never gotten a full genome. And people think, oh, well, direwolves are in La Brea tar pit. There's thousands of skulls if you go out there, and it's a pretty cool display. But all those, due to heat and acidification of the tar, none of them produce viable DNA. And so what we did is we said, we know a lot about dog cloning. We know a lot about, genetics in dogs and wolves and right now. So it'd be an interesting project. We went and met with some indigenous people groups here in the United States and said, how do you guys feel about wolves? How do you feel about potentially direwolves? Because they were mostly a North American species. And many of the tribes that we met with talked about the great wolf and how it was this larger, white, crazy flowing hair. So they had all these mythological stories about it outside of things like Game of Thrones or World of Warcraft, and so people they said many of their people believe that it was the direwolf. So we kind of had this feedback from the indigenous people group, which is interesting, from these different indigenous people groups, which was interesting. Then we had this idea that we could actually help wolves. So it kind of was a project that almost came up. I wish we could say, we were going to go do the direwolf. We actually didn't. It kind of kept coming up. And so we said, let's just go sample it. So what it means is we went and actually sampled the tooth that only gave about 0.15x. And then we also sampled inner ear bone of a skull, petrous bone, which is an inner ear bone of a skull. And using kind of our proprietary methods and some new technologies that we developed, we ended up giving about 500 times the data that anyone else had. We got about 13 reads of the full genome, of two genomes that were separated by about 60,000 years of genetic divergence. And what's great about that is it really allowed us to identify from a fixed perspective what genes really made a direwolf, right? Because in 60,000, there's more genetic diversity in time between our two direwolf samples than our most recent direwolf sample and today, because there's only 12,500 years and there were 60,000 years. So we got very, very lucky on the ancient DNA. And then we had already built this end-to-end stack that we've been working on, the Tasmanian tiger and the mammoth on from a mammalian perspective outside the dodo work. And so we said, let's go do the comparative genomics. We did all of that work, and we found a couple of things interesting. One, they were closer related to wolves, not jackals, as was previously thought. We also found that that the core phenotypes or physical attributes were driven by a couple of known genes, which was great. We got pretty lucky in that. And then we actually had coverage in parts of the genome that drove things like hair and coat color and whatnot. So there were things that we didn't know about the direwolf from a morphological perspective, what their coat color was or coat.
We don't know this. The hairs don't survive, right?
Yeah, the hairs don't survive.
Yeah.
And so we knew from the genetics they were white, right? I can't tell you definitively all direwolves were white, but I can tell you that two different direwolves over over 60,000 years of genetic divergence in two different locations were white. So I'm going to tell, and they were a Pleistocene wolf. So I'd say most signs point to they were white, right?
Sure.
And so, which was interesting because we had to overcome that with the public because they had seen a picture drawn by an artist of a direwolf, not like a cave drawing, but like a picture 5 years ago, 6 years of an artist. And so, you see an iconic photo of something, you're like, oh, that's what it looks like, right? But it turns out Game of Thrones got it right; they were white, which was interesting. But we didn't know what the hair was going to be like. We knew that the direwolf variants of specific hair genes, but we didn't know what it was going to look like. We didn't know what the texture and everything was going to look like, because even though we could predict that they were going to be white or very, very light colored, we could not, based on what we know about these certain gene associations, we didn't know what the actual hair was going to be like. We just knew what the specific direwolf hair variants were. So it was kind of fun when you see them, and they're like, when they were first born, they kind of look like little baby polar bears because they were so fluffy. And like, wow, that is really thick. But we didn't know that from the data. We knew what the gene-specific variants were, but we didn't know what it was. And so in all the species that we're doing, and this could be part of my coding background, but we try to look for what are the core genes that drive the core phenotypes, because you can't clone an extinct species. There's no living DNA. There's no living cells, so you can't clone. If we just clone, that'd make my life super easy, right? We have to spend a lot of time on. It's almost like, think about it as like almost like rebuilding extinct species for today. And so we rebuilt the direwolf based on the core traits it's lost over time. And direwolves were pretty closely related to wolves. And they're about 99, I think it's like 99.8% or something like that, genetically the same. And then the core phenotypes that we identified from the skeletal morphology, we identified those genes that had been fixed across this 60,000 years of genetic divergence, and we engineered them into a gray wolf platform.
So technically, it's a hybrid.
Well, so it's a great question. So no. And this is one of the things that's always very, very interesting. Technically, we are all, like including you and me, we're technically what's called admixtures. So hybrids are technically, to be scientifically accurate, are technically what's considered F1 generations. So if you take a polar bear, for example, and a brown bear, which are two different species, and that's a whole nother interesting conversation. There's about 30 different ways to classify a species, and many of them don't agree with each other, which is just ludicrously stupid. Because think about this. This is a human thing that we try to put on this. And what's interesting is when we announced the direwolf, we had over 100 billion media impressions. We had 22,000 stories about the direwolf, which was crazy. About 4% of them were negative, and half of those people just wanted to argue on what makes a species. And we're like, well, you tell us whatever makes a species.
We'll figure it out.
And so, yeah, it's like, because there's about 30 ways. Well, so if you look at the polar bear example and the brown bear, they're able to produce offspring. That first offspring between two different species that mate is considered an F1 generation. That's considered a hybrid. Every generation beyond that's considered what's called an admixture. So if you do 23andMe or whatever I did, I've got some Neanderthal in me. Maybe you do too. So we're not Neanderthal Homo sapien hybrids. We're just admixtures. Like, we're still humans, right? And so that's how evolution works. It kind of works as kind of this river. And so they're really kind of admixtures, just like everything else on the planet. They would have to breed. We would have to breed them with another purebred other animal to create an F1 generation. That's technically a hybrid. But once again, I don't really. That's just the accurate definition of these things. But some people call them hybrids. Some people call them direwolves, because some people call them rebuilt direwolves. Someone recently was calling them direwolf 2.0s, which I think was kind of funny from a software perspective. But that's what's interesting is it's like, if we were able to clone the first, which we can't because there's no cells, right? But if you were able to clone our 73,000-year-old skull, and you were to clone our 12,000-year-old skull, their genetic divergence would be more than what we've engineered.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. I think the substantive question with the whole hybrid thing is, is this the same thing, or is this at least sufficiently different for it to be a new thing?
Or is it something new, right?
Yeah,
So people do that. Well, that kind of goes back to the speciation question. And so by some definitions, polar bear, if you look at a polar bear, take out speciation for a second and think of it like a child. To go back to your 5-year-old self, right? Like, as you said, it's like if you show. So I have a 15-month-old. If I show my kid a picture of a polar bear and I show my picture of a brown bear, they're both bears,
right?
But they're not the same. They're not like, if you say, are these the same? I think my kid's even smart enough at this age to be like, no, they're not the same, right? Like, one's bigger, one's a pure carnivore, being the polar bear. It's aquatic adapted. It's white. It has different hair type. But interestingly enough, so you would assume the way that we define species, or one of the 30 ways we define species, these are different. So they're different species. That kind of makes sense. But interestingly enough, one of the main speciation definitions people talk about is if they can interbreed and create viable offspring, then they should be the same species. They breed all the time, and they create viable offspring all the time between brown bears and polar bears. So by many definitions of speciation, they should be considered the same species. But if you look at them, they're not the same thing, right? They're both bears. Right. So this whole idea of like taxa and classification and hybridization, these are all human constructs that we are, because we as humans like to put things in boxes. That's how we think, right? That we like to compartmentalize things. That's how humans process data in certain ways better than we process other types of data. And so we try to put that on nature, and nature just doesn't work like that. So it's interesting. So our view is, is it something new? Is it we think of it as a rebuilt extinct species? Is it something new? Not really, because it's based on the same evolutionary platform of the gray wolves, layering in the core genes that drove phenotypes.
Got it.
So, could it be a variant of could it be in that 60,000 years of genetic divergence, if you rolled the dice enough times in evolution, could you get the exact combination? Possibly. Yeah, it's hard to say.